A good Erev Shabbos. Must a Jew believe anything? This is the title of a book written a few years ago by a professor in Israel who's also an expert on Maimonides and also happens to be a rabbi. It's a fair question to ask, and ask ourselves especially this week as we stand together with all Jews everywhere to hear the 10 Commandments read, the Aseres HaDibros, delivered to us from God at Mount Sinai in Parshas Yisro. It's a particularly significant question because the first of those 10 is, quote, I am God, your God, who took you out of Egypt, end quote. Is that a commandment? Well, it's called the 10 Commandments, but only in English. In Hebrew, it's called Aseres HaDibros, the 10 sayings. Maybe that's a better way to look at it. But then again, isn't it a commandment? What is a commandment exactly? Is it simply, as the name implies, something that a commander commands and the followers have to follow? Maybe it's a good deed. Many translate mitzvah as a good deed. Some of them don't necessarily sound like good deeds so much. If you've been listening to the daily review of Halacha for the last few months, we've gone now through Maimonides' entire list of 613 mitzvahs, one by one, and we just finished mitzvah number 613 yesterday. We'll leave them up there on the website for you to watch. We began way back in the middle of June, and we went through all the mitzvahs one by one. Frequently, and in conversations at KST, we render mitzvah as a connection with God, connection with our own souls, with our own selves, with the Jewish nation. We frequently think of mitzvahs as something to do, or in 365 instances, something not to do. There's a mitzvah to sanctify Shabbat, that we do with Kiddush. There's a mitzvah to eat matzah on Pesach. We accomplish that by eating matzah on Pesach. There's a mitzvah to honor our parents, which we do in many ways. The other side of the mitzvah coin is the prohibitions. We keep the mitzvah of not eating non-kosher by not eating non-kosher, and so on. Those are a little bit less tangible. But what about belief? Is that an action, or is it a thought, an attitude? Is it a position or a stance? And what is the mitzvah involved in the first of these 10 commandments? I am God, your God. Is that something that we affirm? Is it something we believe or we repeat over and over? What is it exactly? And how can you count thoughts as a mitzvah? Maybe one way to phrase it is belief in Hashem the basis for all the other mitzvahs, or is it a mitzvah in itself amongst all the others? Now remember, no one person can do all the mitzvahs. You'd have to be both a Kohen and a Yisrael, a man and a woman at the same time. Different mitzvahs for different people in different situations. Again, if you've been listening to that daily count, you know that we'd also have to live in times of the temple as well. But the mitzvahs that are within our ability to accomplish at the moment, Torah study, matzah at the Seder, Shabbat, kashrut. Does a person have to believe in God to do these? Or is belief and faith one of the other mitzvahs on the list? One of those things that, if I get around to it, I'll do it. Some years ago, we had a discussion about what one researcher called the social orthodox. People who daven at traditional shuls, they say certain words, they participate enthusiastically in the social side of Jewish life and even the intellectual side. They learn, but belief maybe isn't one of their strong suits. They may even claim not to believe. What does that say about the fulfillment of mitzvahs? Is it a good deed to come to shul, to daven, to light a menorah, if you don't believe in the source of good? Is it a commandment if you don't believe in the commander? A connection if you aren't interested in connecting? That's all for another time. Let's look at some of the conversation over the course of Jewish thinking about this point. Rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra lived in Spain in the 1100s. He wonders if feelings can be considered mitzvahs. That's one of our questions at hand. He's actually looking just a little bit further down the list of 10 commandments where it says, do not covet. Don't feel jealousy at something that your neighbor owns or has. How can that be a mitzvah? If you have the feeling, how is the mitzvah going to stop you from having the feeling? Similar to the positive mitzvah of love God, your God. V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha. If you love God, so you don't really need a mitzvah to tell you. And if you don't have the feeling, how can you have the feeling because there's a mitzvah to do it? And we have other feelings that it's a mitzvah to feel, right? To love your fellow as yourself. And on the prohibition side, it's prohibited to hate another in your heart. So Ibn Ezra writes, many have thought that except for idolatry, which is the worst of sins, no human thought can be considered good and evil all in itself. And yet, we read in so many different places that it seems to indicate otherwise. And he quotes from all over Tanakh. 1 Kings chapter 8 says, you did well, for it was within your heart. Psalm 125. Do good, O God, to those who are good, and to those who are upright in their hearts. 17th chapter of Jeremiah. I am God who searches the heart. So we're hard-pressed to say that it doesn't matter what's in your heart, what your feelings are, when there seems to be so much evidence that it is important. It seems that feelings can be part of the commandments, in addition to actions, doing some things and not doing some other things. But that doesn't completely address the issue of whether belief in God is a mitzvah too. Should it be? Isn't it the basis for everything? The great Maimonides says, yes, it's a mitzvah. Belief in God is one of the mitzvot, one of the 613. Another compiler of mitzvahs, whose book is called the Halachot Gedolot, Halachas Gedolos. So the author is called Bal Halachas Gedolos, or Bahag. We use the initials. His mother probably didn't call him the Bahag, though. She called him Shimele. We believe the author was Shimon Kayara, who lived most probably in Babylon, but some say in Cairo, in the early 800s. The Bal Halachas Gedolos held that belief in Hashem is the foundation of the mitzvahs, and as such, it's not a separate mitzvah all on its own. So his list of 613 mitzvahs does not include belief in God. It's the undergirding and the basis, the foundation for everything. Others hold a middle ground. Rabbi Yosef Albo from Spain, and the Sefer Mitzvot Gadol by Rabbi Moshe of Kusi, written in around 1245 or so, as well as Sefer Mitzvot Katan by Rabbi Yitzchak of Korbel just a few years later, are examples. They teach that this verse we're talking about, the first of the 10 commandments, I am God, your God, is in fact one of the 613 mitzvot. And it means to believe that God watches over the whole world. Or as the Smag says, it's a mitzvah to believe in Torah from Sinai. Now, let's look a little bit more into Rambam's view, since we just this week completed study of one of Rambam's very influential works. Rambam puts belief in God as the very first of 248 positive mitzvos, and number one on the list of prohibitions is the prohibition that we are forbidden to deny God's existence. And then in the more comprehensive work, Mishnah Torah, he writes, it is the foundation of all foundations and the pillar of wisdom to know that there is a primary being who brought all existence into being. Yesod ha-Yesodos, writes the Rambam, v'amud ha-chachmos, leida sheyesham matzui rishon, v'hu mamtzi kol nimtza. Notice, by the way, in this very important first halacha of the Mishnah Torah, Rambam does not say believe, he says you have to know. You're supposed to know, which is a different thing than belief, which is something you don't necessarily know. How can that be? Well, it seems directly related to our parsha this week. When we stand to hear the Aseres HaDibros read out loud from the middle, actually the sixth aliyah of Parshas Yisro, we are hearing the words that God spoke directly to Am Yisrael. I am God, your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt from the house of servitude. Anoichi Hashem Elokecha, Asher hoitzeisicha me'eretz Mitzrayim, mi beis avadim. That is the voice of God speaking to us. We hear it, we know it. So belief is not a factor, because at the moment the entire Jewish people experience it. If you hear it and you see it for yourself, you don't believe it, you know it. I was there. Rambam discusses the two dibros, the first two that we heard directly mipi hagvura, from God directly, not through the medium of Moshe's transmission, like we heard, which is the way we heard the remaining 8. And he writes, I am God, and you shall have no other gods before me. These, says Rambam, are the foundations of Judaism. These two commandments teach that God is real and God is one. The Torah points out that while the name for God, Elokim, accepts different endings, Elokecha, Elokeinu, Elokechem, right? The Shem Hashem never has an ending. That's because Elokim is how God appears to us in nature, through history, in the world around us. So it follows that that aspect of God's revelation is refracted through the lens of nature, or whatever it is. Yet the Shem Hashem, Shem Adnus, that we read, when we use when we daven and when we read from the Torah, that is unchanging, expressing God's immutable, unchangeable essence. This is what was revealed to us at Mount Sinai, Shem Hashem, the very essence of God, in a way that we could connect to. It also suggests, by the way, that all barriers between God and us, and among all of us, the whole Jewish people, are not really real, although sometimes they appear to be. And as we understand the rest of the 10 Commandments, and really all the 613 Commandments we've been studying for this last half a year, every morning, revelation of God's essence to us through Torah gives us the possibility of bringing it all together, uniting worlds, physical and spiritual. Which comes back now to our original question about thinking and doing, about mitzvot and belief, practical mitzvot and belief, which we weren't so sure about. The second chapter of Rambam's Laws of Foundation of the Torah, Hilchas Yisodei HaTorah, which we quoted before, talks about the commandments to love and to have awe of God, Yisro. And then Rambam writes several chapters about the wondrousness of all God's creation and invites us to reflect on that and how that brings us to awe and love of God. The rest of the work, running to 14 volumes, describes all the practical mitzvot that we're used to talking about. Honest business practices, honoring your parents, tzedakah, mezuzahs, tefillin, tithing crops, kosher meat, all that. So we learn that it's by connecting all of our life to Hashem through the mitzvot that we accomplish our purpose and fulfill our potential, using our hands, using our voices, our hearts and souls, our intellectual capabilities, and our neshamas. Every part of our being and everything in our world has the possibility to be part of our Jewish life, our Jewish being. As we say every day, love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Joining ourselves in our precious Kehillah, together with Jews around the world, reading this Parsha this Shabbat, and experiencing its transcendence, we go forward to inhabit and settle the land, not only the land of Israel, but also the land wherever we have landed, our lives, and everything that we touch and affect in the world around us. Good Shabbos.